What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Officer Training School. My name is Joushi Howard, and today we're going to be talking about something different than we normally talk about. Instead of a specific unit, we're going to be talking about detachments. And the first one that we're going to be covering is going to be Combined Arms, the index detachment that was recently updated in order to be useful in the Codex. Today, we're going to be talking about the basics of the detachment, how insane lethal hits really is. We'll talk about the enhancements and the stratagems that come along with combined arms, talk about the basic game plan of how this detachment actually plays, some good units, and then we'll finally go over some example lists of how you can potentially try and make this detachment work for yourself. So the basic things to think about when you're playing combined arms is we are S tier detachment at playing basic 40k, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the video. But combined is really good at trading, combined is really good at playing the primary mission, and combined is really good at just doing a little bit of everything. Combined lists are usually going to need a mix of tanks and infantry, but it has a lot of flexibility where on that spectrum you want to be. As long as you're bringing some infantry and some tanks, you're going to be able to put together a pretty reasonable list. So the first thing that we need to talk about in terms of combined arms is where its power comes from. And so much of the power of combined arms comes from the fact that lethal hits is one of the most insane rules in the game. Remember how everyone was losing their minds about how powerful Mordako was because it had sustained hits too? Well, Guard basically has sustained hits too on everything, but we're going to have to explain exactly why this is. So the math is not necessarily intuitive for a lot of people, but basically the way that you have to think about this is the number of attacks that you need to make in order to convert them into wounds and force your opponent to actually make saves. We have an example on screen right now of what it looks like to have a lasgun with sustained hits 2 versus the same lasgun with lethal hits shooting at marine bodies. And you can see, if you go down along the path, that even though the number of hits is very different between the sustained hits 2 lasgun and the lethal hits lasgun, they both deal the same number of wounds, which means that it will translate into the same number of failed saves on average. But the really important thing to think about is if you wound something on a 5+, that means that you are going to convert 1/3 of your successful hits into wounds. And the reverse of that is 2/3 of your hits will fail to convert into a successful wound. So for hits on 3s, 4s, and 5s, nothing happens. This is exactly the way it normally works. However, a sustained hit, if you get sustained 2, you're going to be getting 3 successful hits. And 1/3 of those are then going to convert into wounds. Lethal hits skips this step. Lethal hits skips the part of having the extra hits and just says we are going to get the average number of wounds through. And that's only because when we triple the number of hits, it is the same thing as wounding 1/3 of the time and skipping that step and just getting the average. But this becomes even more insane when we look at what happens if we are wounding on a 6+. An easy example for this is if we were taking a lasgun and shooting it at a Custodes Warden, which is toughness 6. We're going to be wounding that on a 6, and therefore, in order to get the same number of wounds through as we would with lethal hits, we would need sustained hits 5. Now, as the strength approaches the toughness, this gets worse and worse. If we are wounding on a 4, lethal hits is the same as sustained hits 1, because we double the hits every time we roll a 6, but only half of the successful hits are actually converting into wounds. Now, if we're winning on a 3+, it's about equal to sustained hits 0.5, and if we're winning on a 2+, again, it's reducing even further. It's roughly equivalent to sustained hits 1/6, or approximately 0.17. Now, this is extremely relevant for combined arms. And the main reason for this is because we are able to bring a crap ton of Melta, which is strength 9, and Plasma, which is strength 8. And most vehicles that we are going to be shooting at are things like Predators or other Lehman Russes, or sometimes Land Raiders. This is all going to be toughness 10, 11, or 12, which means that all of our weapons are going to be wounding vehicles on a 5+. So whenever we're taking one of our vehicles and shooting at an opponent vehicle or monster with lethal hits, it's roughly equivalent to having Meltas and Plasma with sustained hits too. Once you understand how absolutely ridiculous the math really becomes with lethal hits, you'll start to understand why combined arms lethal hits is so powerful. It takes all of our vehicles and turns them up to 11. And in a meta that has been dominated by other vehicles and monsters for the past year and a half or so, the fact that our vehicles are punching up into opponents' vehicles and monsters is a huge benefit to the way that Combined Arms plays. So Combined Arms instantly becomes a premier shooting army instantly. And this is a defining part of why Guard is one of the stronger armies in the game, is because it is so good at playing this trading game against enemy vehicles, and that will trade into our ability to play the mission incredibly efficiently. Next, let's go ahead and take a little bit of time to talk about the enhancements. There's really only one enhancement in Combined Arms that's really worth the time to look at, and it's going to be Grand Strategist. You'll see this one taken in a majority of Combined Arms armies, usually going to be on a squadron officer, so right now a Rogaldorn commander, but maybe in the next balance patch you will see it go on Leman Russ commanders. And at that point, you've mostly solved your order economy. You can take another Leman Russ or a Rogaldorn commander and allow it to order even more tanks, but you really only need the one in order to make a lot of Combined Arms lists work. The rest are not that good. Drill Commander is really hard to use, and it's just too expensive for what it really does. Because it requires you to remain stationary, most of our infantry is not going to have an opportunity to do that. So there are some cute things you can do with rapid ingress, or putting a unit out in the open, and then spending a lot of CP to keep it alive, but most of the time our infantry is not going to have the punch it really needs to make this worth it. Another common mistake that I see is Drill Commander does not work on any squadron units. One of the things that Drill Commander says is, while this model is leading a unit, and none of our squadron officers can lead a unit, the Rogaldorn commander, the Leman Russ commander cannot lead a squadron of tanks. So, it will never affect any of the tanks. Death Mask of Alanius is fine if you have a couple of points left over, but it's basically just having a flag in your unit, and cool, sure. It shouldn't really be a major part of your strategy at any point, but it can be nice to have if you have a couple of points left over at the end. Reactive Command is one of the biggest useless waste of points that you can possibly think of at 15 points, because it only comes up when your opponent disembarks from a transport near you, or if they are able to set up within 6 inches, such as with a 6-inch deep strike or other similar ability. I would not be surprised if this got rewritten at some point. Next, let's go ahead and talk about the stratagems that come in Combined Arms. During the Index, the stratagems that Combined Regiment had at the time were not very good. You had several of them that were just completely dead, but at least in Combined Arms during the Codex, 5 of them are ones that you actually use reasonably often. So going through them in the order that we actually had them presented in the Codex, we have Coordinated Action. And Coordinated Action allows you to have a regiment unit and a squadron unit. They need to be within 6 inches of each other and visible to each other, and it says at the start of a phase, you basically allow them to have the orders that the other one is also giving to them. I'll use this maybe once per game, but it's the kind of stratagem that you have to keep in mind, and it's not one that you just stumble into. You have to be looking for opportunities to use it. The most common way that you use this stratagem is if you have a vehicle that you want to move, and also want it to take aim. So you can order move to a regiment unit that is close to the tank, splash it over to the tank, but give the tank take aim, and then it will move 13 inches and then still shoot. This doesn't come up all that often, but when it does, it can be game-changing, because suddenly you're going to be able to shoot targets that your opponent might not have thought that you were going to be shooting nearly as hard as you were able to. The next one is Fields of Fire. And Fields of Fire is a stratagem that you use almost every turn. The way it works, you point at a regiment unit, you point at a squadron unit, they do not need to be able to see each other, and they do not need to be able to see the enemy unit that you also point at. And the stratagem says that if the regiment unit or the squadron unit shoot at that enemy unit, you get a bonus AP against it. This is just good. It just improves your AP, and it does stack with Exterminators and Hellhounds, so you can make your Rogaldorns or your Leonos battle tanks plus 2 AP ignoring cover. There is nothing more fun than pointing to your opponent's Land Raider and saying, yes, I'm shooting at AP6 ignoring cover. Even if you use Armor of Contempt, you are not getting a save against my Melta shots. This one is one of the main reasons why you include Ursa Creed in your army, is simply because being able to do this stratagem for free and then also farm command points off of it is an incredibly powerful combination. The next one, and the one that was potentially the most impactful during the days of the Index, was Reinforcements. And these days, I use it maybe once per game. It was a major defining part of the way that the Index Combined Regiment actually played, when you would endlessly recycle Khazarkin or sometimes Rough Riders. But now I mostly use it to create late-game reserves threats, and it makes secret missions really easy to try and block the Battle Line 1, and also to do the Battle Line 1 where you need Battle Line in their deployment zone at the end of the game. But because I'm tending to spend a lot more points on Grenade and Tank Shock, I don't generally find myself having Reinforcement CP unless I'm specifically trying to make sure I do. Another one that I will threaten my opponent with all the time is Inspired Command. However, I don't actually use it that often. Inspired Command says during your opponent's command phase, you can target one of your officers and have it give an order to a unit within range. What this is usually used to do is you're going to move something onto an objective that does not have enough OC to take it from your opponent during your turn. However, with Inspired Command, you can then turn something that is only 2 OC and turn it into 3 OC, or just make that unit of Catachan that is currently 4 OC on a point and turn it into 6 OC on a point by making each one an additional OC. So it's usually used to remind your opponent, hey, I could make this more OC if I wanted to in order to take it away from you, but I'll usually only use it about once per game in order to actually make that plan happen. The next one that you'll use once or twice per game is called Flexible Command. Flexible Command costs 2 command points, and you can target as many of the officers in your army as you want. And this stratagem says that if your officer normally gave orders to regiment units, it can now give them to squadron units, and if your officer used to be able to give orders to squadron units, it is now able to do so to regiment units. This is a stratagem that is way more useful in armies that have a lot more tanks and a lot more infantry. Infantry orders tend to be fairly cheap, whereas squadron orders tend to be a little bit harder to come by. So the way that it becomes really useful is if your opponent gives you an opportunity for a big go turn, and you have more tanks than you have tank orders. Suddenly, you just have Creed go, I am actually now able to order tanks, and you can order your entire tank battalion all at once. And suddenly, your entire army pretends they're Space Marines because they're hitting on 3s. The last one is Stalwart Protector, and I have never used it. You can target a vehicle, and that vehicle, if it is obscuring some of your regiment units, can give them cover, which is thematically really cool. If you've ever watched any World War II movies and watch all the infantry following the tanks around to make sure that they are blocked out from small arms fire, it feels like that. However, it's just worse than go to ground. So if you've already done go to ground and you still have a lot of CP and you still need to put something else in cover, I guess you could do this one, but you don't really ever do it. So at the beginning of the video, I said that Combined Arms is one of the premier detachments in the game for playing basic 40k, and I've made several videos on this topic already. I'll try and put them up on the screen, but they are the trading game, the basic game plan, and Coach Gaylord episode 1. But if you haven't seen those videos or you're new to the channel, here's a recap of basically the game plan of how Combined Arms and the basic game plan of 40k is actually played. So to start off, this is your home objective. Your goal is to hold it every turn. Pretty straightforward. Next, we got to talk about your natural expansion objective. You can identify your natural expansion on most deployment zones by 1, it is closer to your deployment zone than it is to your opponent's. It is usually about 9 inches away from your deployment zone, and usually about 15 to 20 inches away from your opponent's deployment zone. Secondly, from our deployment zone, you can shoot nearly all of it. And thirdly, your opponent can't shoot it from most of their deployment zone. There are a lot of examples of different terrain formats and different deployment setups where this becomes a little bit less clear, especially if you're playing Hammer and Anvil or Dawn of War. But in those situations, you're usually figuring it out based on which one is it easier for me to stand on than it is for my opponent. And the one that you can stand on and your opponent is going to struggle to is going to be your natural expansion. Lastly, there's the center objective. The center is very difficult for either army to hold early in the game because at the beginning of the game, both armies are at their most lethal. Turn 2 is the most lethal turn in the entire game. You have access to your entire army, and that's when all of your reserves are suddenly able to come in if they want to. The game will therefore get less lethal as the game goes on, as people lose access to more and more units. Some of their guns have already been taken out, some of their big melee units can no longer function because they've taken too many casualties, and the game will get less lethal as the game goes. However, control of the middle of the board allows you to score points very easily. Having control of the middle allows you to score area denial. It allows you to score your second cleanse. It allows you to get to your opponent's side of the board in order to score behind enemy lines. You can go out of the middle if you start there in order to get engaged on all fronts. You're able to pull line of sight on a lot of different targets by being in the middle of the board. And of course, by standing on the middle objective, you're threatening to score primary when your opponent is not. You don't generally try and hold the middle objective early on in the game, but what you generally do is you put something on the middle objective to force your opponent to trade with you. And because we tend to do way more damage because we have lethal hits than a lot of our opponents do, this allows us to just outshoot a lot of our opponents as soon as they actually allow us to shoot them. So with this in mind, on a majority of missions, and I'm sure you can think of counterexamples, our goal is we're going to hold our home objective and our natural every single turn. We do this by using durable units like infantry and transports, 20 bricks of Krieg, hellhounds, command squads with Ogren bodyguards, Ogren, and tanks to stand on the objective and be difficult for our opponent to remove or out OC. At the same time, we are endeavoring to deny our opponent from holding their natural expansion 2 or 3 times. And in most missions, this will build us a primary lead of about 10 to 15 points. Obviously, if our opponent lets us do more than this by holding the center, or by denying their primary for more than 2 or 3 turns, we will do that as well. But our general goal is most competent players will only allow us to do this somewhere between 1 and 3 times. If we have a primary lead and we score about equal with our opponents on secondary cards, we are going to outscore our opponents, and that's how we generally build our wins. So, let's talk about how we actually accomplish this game plan. So firstly, we want long-range guns. This allows us to control the center and make sure our opponent isn't scoring it, and also to protect our natural. They will provide some use in trying to take away our opponent's natural, but competent opponents isn't generally going to let us just shoot them off of their own natural. Second, we want hard-to-remove assets. This is how we control our natural objective. On many deployment zones, we can hide on our natural objective, and it's very difficult for our opponent to get us off of there. On these, we can use things like Catachan or Cadians who just stand on the objective. But on the center and more exposed deployment zones, we're going to use things like 20 bricks of Krieg, infantry and transports, and more durable things like Hellhounds. The last thing that we really want is we want access to fast OC. Fast OC tends to be units with scout and things in transports. And ideally, they can do both. This is why Catachan and Tauroxes or Chimeras, Kazarkin, Krieg Engineers are all very valuable to put in a transport in order to deny our opponent's expansion on multiple turns. We put this all together, and you end up getting an army that has a little bit of everything. You're going to have a couple of Leman Russes, you're going to have some units of infantry, you're going to have a couple of transports, maybe you can have a couple of artillery units in here, depending on the points that they are currently costing. You might see some, you might not see any. It goes back and forth. And so we'll just talk about the units that Combined Arms tends to promote. The first thing is anything that has access to reroll hits. This is why the Leman Russ Battle Tank is so good in Combined Arms and just okay in other detachments. Remember, the Meltas, Plasmas, and the main gun effectively have sustained 2 against a lot of targets. And when you have access to rerolls, suddenly that becomes a lot more powerful. Other things that we like are vehicles that have high volume of fire. This is the Rogel Dorn and the Rogel Dorn Commander, the Exterminator, which is basically rolling a 5 on number of shots, and the Chimera, which just has a ton of plinky shots. These are the tools that make the best use of the lethal hit, especially into the large enemy targets that our opponents have been presenting us. Next, we want fast OC, because it is easy for us to put that OC on objectives and also to increase its OC even higher with Inspired Command. These are things like Catachan and Kazarkin and transports, so the Chimera and the Taurox. And Attilan Rough Riders are also really good, despite the fact that they don't actually make that great use of the lethal hits. They're just fast, and they're OC that we can make OC2. The last thing we really look at for Combined Arms are good reinforcements targets. Throughout most of 10th edition, the premier target for this has been Kazarkin. But recently, it has also been including 20 bricks of Krieg and Cadians. You can also do it on units of 10-man Scions and 10-man Catachan, but they're less valuable in terms of actually just creating damage and high-value units that are going to come back. Lastly, let's go ahead and take a little bit of time to look at some example lists and look at why they're successful. Current top lists can mostly be divided into 2 basic archetypes. The first one is midboard units and tanks. This has a lot of elite infantry, infantry blobs, and transports as most of the army, and it's supported by 2 to 4 tanks. We've seen this archetype have a lot of success. And after the Bridgehead nerf, it has become the most commonly successful archetype in terms of doing well at GTs. While it does have the damage to table our opponent if our opponent lets us, most of the time it's playing to disable the enemy army to make sure that they cannot stop us from scoring our primary after we've done enough to stop their primary once or twice. On the opposite end of the spectrum, it's tanks and midboard. These tend to start with 5 to 8 medium to large tanks or Leman Russes and Rogel Dorns. And then you'll have a couple of midboard units, but they're usually not the focus. And one of the main arguments of this style of list is that tanks like Vanquishers are midboard tanks. They're able to fill multiple roles because they're not only doing damage, but they're difficult to remove, and they can create a lot of pressure on the board. These style of lists tend to be trying to kill our opponent because they don't score as well as ones that are dominated by midboard units. Remember, though, that these are 2 opposite sides of the spectrum. As long as you have a couple of tanks and a couple of midboard units, you have a lot of freedom to fill in the rest. If you want a little bit of indirect, you can. If you want tanks to be your midboard, you can. If you want just more utility by including Scions and Gaunt's Ghost, you can. So the first example I want to look at is Nassim Fouchain, and this is a list that he took to his most recent GT. Asim is one of the best players in the world, and a lot of the list that he writes tends to become dominant in the way that a lot of guard players actually try and play the game. But it is the perfect example of a list that is mid-board and then tanks. You can see here that it has all the major parts of what we would look for in terms of a successful guard army. You have durable units in the Death Corps of Krieg and the Rogel Dorn. And then you have fast OC in Catachan Jungle Fighters and Kazarkin in transports, as in the Chimera and the Torox. And then you have the long-range guns in the Rogaldorn Commander and the double Lehman Russ battle tank. You're able to do a little bit of everything, and you have a lot of control over the board. The opposite side of this is played by friend of the channel, David Purcell. And this is a fantastic example of tanks in midboard. This list archetype includes 6 different Lehman Russes, 2 Lehman Russ battle tanks, a Lehman Russ exterminator, and 3 Lehman Russ vanquishers. In addition, it has a Hellhound and a Rogaldorn Commander for a total of 8 vehicles that are at least toughness 10 with a 2+ save. Nothing in this army is trivial to remove. The easiest things to kill are a Torox, which is toughness 8, and 2 Scout Sentinels, which are toughness 7. This is a little bit harder to play on average for most players because you have to be using your Vanquishers and your Hellhound in particular to be creating a lot of space for you on the board and using them in ways that a lot of people don't think is very natural to them. But this archetype of list has been very successful for David over the past year and a half. So overall, hopefully this has been helpful for you when you think about how to play combined arms. If you enjoy this type of video, make sure you let me know down in the comments. Please give me a like, subscribe, and consider joining the channel. For now though, this has been Officer Training School. We've been talking about combined arms, and of course, I have been your host, Joshua Joshi Howard. We will see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.